Lawyers, what's the worst case you've seen in court, whether it's criminal, civil, or divorce proceedings where someone beat the other person? Not the worst, but there was an outstanding case where a man decided to call attention to himself. A woman showed up in court wearing a t-shirt that read, "Party time, bitches." Drink up? It was her first appearance on her third DUI charge. The judge was in no mood for jokes that day. A case not from my practice, but still a favorite. Dude totally screwed up when he showed up to a court hearing where he was charged with burglary wearing the same distinctive hoodie as the night he committed the crime. At that point, it became difficult for the defense attorney to argue that the guy in the video was not his client. I guess needless to say, the perp was convicted and sent to a correctional facility for several years. I'm not a lawyer, but when my wife's father and mother divorced, she wanted to file a joint tax return for the previous year because they were still married. That way they would get a decent tax refund. He insisted on filing separately, even though he'd have to pay $4,000 on top because he wanted her to owe the IRS too. He did so to get her fired up. I'm sitting waiting for my client, and at that moment the judge is having a formal conversation with several defendants to choose a punishment in a DUI case. It was about probation. Q. Has anyone used alcohol or drugs in the last 24 hours? Everyone answers properly, but one dude proudly raises his hand. I smoked some dope last night. He didn't get probation. I won't go into details because of confidentiality, but I had a client who was accused of a very heinous sex crime. He had an alibi. He was at work at the time, where he holds a supervisory position. One coworker could absolutely say he was there. I spoke to the employee and he confirmed it. The trial is coming up, and around that time, I need to send a notice of intent to provide an alibi, that is, advance notice to the court, so they can check the alibi and determine if it's true. But I'm cautious, so I call that employee again. Turns out my client had managed to fire him in the meantime, so the employee tells me quite frankly, yeah, he was definitely at work. But that's not what I'm going to say in court. Screw him, let him go to jail. I didn't call him as a witness or file an alibi. We still won the trial, but if I hadn't thought to call the guy or if he had been less forthcoming, my client would have been in a lot of trouble. Sex offender registry, jail time, the whole thing. And he's completely innocent. I once witnessed a defendant in custody who had no means to cover the costs of defending himself in court tell a judge that his public defender was not working hard enough and he wanted the judge to appoint him another lawyer. Judge asked what specifically he was dissatisfied with, and he replied, "I don't need a female attorney. I need a man who can approach the case responsibly and fight for me." Well, or something similar. The judge, also a woman, said it doesn't work that way. And that's when he started yelling and going into detail about his government lawyer. Basically, his claims were as follows. I don't like her. She doesn't schedule appointments with me, and so on. The judge looks at him irritably and says, okay, I'll assign you another defense, but since you are not satisfied with your lawyer and I need time to assign a new one, I will not take your case today and will remand it for a new trial. A few days later, the judge sends the defendant a notice of appointment of a new attorney, who also happens to be a woman, and a notice of a 6-week postponement. Initially, the conversation was about bail, and the district attorney and public defender agreed to release him on unsecured bail, which meant he would have been out the same day if he hadn't thrown a tantrum. Instead, he sat in jail for another 6 weeks only to have another female lawyer represent him. Not a lawyer, but a hilarious case between a father and son took place in my town. The father is a well-known personal injury attorney here who started his own firm under his name George Sink, and his son ended up joining the family business. Anyway, they had a falling out and the son quit his job to start his own firm, and he had the same name as the father. So the father sued the son for using the name he gave him to start his own law firm. I'm not a lawyer, but this story still amazes me to this day. My biological grandmother died 20 years ago of ovarian cancer and left all of her money trusts and bonds to my grandfather to use while alive and to divide after her death. About 15 years ago, my grandfather married a second time to my step-grandmother. Then, a few years ago, he passed away. My step-aunt is a greedy bitch living on the opposite side of the country who has lived off her mother and my grandfather her whole life. She would visit them and take them on vacations, where she would use their money to buy herself clothes and spend free time at a ski resort, once 8 times a year. After my grandfather died, my step-grandmother had to move to where her children lived to receive care because she developed dementia. The step-aunt was not only given access to her mother's estate to take care of her needs, but also my grandfather's. That wasn't enough. She decided to sue my father and uncle for the inheritance of their deceased biological mother. My father is paralyzed on both sides and moves around in a wheelchair. My uncle has survived 3 heart surgeries, has a pacemaker and many limitations. Both received disability benefits. The court date arrived and I literally rolled my father into the hall while my uncle walked in with his cane. The step-aunt is fully capable and swimming in the millions that my grandfather and step-grandmother had earned their entire lives. One look at the whole picture was enough for the judge to completely bar her access to my biological grandmother's estate. We were there for less than an hour. The wife filed for a restraining order during the divorce proceedings because she wanted the house to remain hers. The husband has a good job with a salary of about $200,000 a year. His employer finds out about the restraining order. Husband gets fired. He worked in a very specialized field, so the only job he can find near the house, ex-wife and daughter brings in $50K a year. The house goes into foreclosure. Child support comes out to less than $500 a month. Wife has to take a part-time job as a waitress. 4 cars repossessed for non-payment. Not a lawyer, but a paralegal. My lawyer is pretty old, so he needs me to find papers in the junk in the courtroom, so I attend all domestic and criminal cases. We had a custody case where the mother screwed up if only because she had to be found to be subpoenaed while the father took his daughter using visitation rights. Anyway, the father's new wife takes the stand and testifies that the mother, the defendant, threatened to blow up their house. The mother comes to the stand and says, "I didn't threaten to blow up your house. I threatened to blow you up." The judge was just shocked. I'm not a lawyer, but my father is a doctor, and he is sometimes called as an expert witness in cases of malpractice. In one memorable case, a family was suing a doctor for something fairly frivolous, and my father was a defense witness. The attorney representing the family was cross-examining my father, and he cited a chapter from a medical textbook as evidence and asked my dad to read the highlighted paragraph. My dad reads it, and the lawyer says something like, "So, what you just read means blah, 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 something in medical." My dad confidently replies, "No, that's not what it means." Lawyer: "No, if you read the hooch, the author clearly states blah, 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 something on medical." Dad: "No, indeed, that's not what the author means." Lawyer: "How do you know that's not what the author meant?" Dad: "Well, because I wrote it." The judge did a facepalm while the lawyer gulped air with his mouth like a goldfish, staring at the author's name listed in the chapter. Basically, it was the best moment of my father's professional life. Yes, the verdict was in favor of the defendant. The case was not mine, but I was following it closely because it was the divorce proceedings of an acquaintance of mine. He and his now ex-wife were dividing commercial real estate that was worth a lot of money. The deeds were on both of them, so they had access to the same information. Well, shit hit the fan, and there was an outstanding debt on the property, and I think it was foreclosed on. The husband tried to talk to his then-wife about all of this, but she just froze. Not only did she ignore him and the financial affairs, but she started cheating on him. Let's move on to the divorce. It goes down as a dispute between the parties, and they start fighting over the primary residence, the market value of which, and the house was debt-free, is much less than the commercial building. She demanded the house, and her husband actually offered to give her the commercial building if he kept the house. She never paid attention to how bad the commercial property was. And for some odd reason, her attorney didn't do any due diligence, so they agreed to the deal. I don't know if the asset distribution included any get-out clauses or reservations for the ex-wife, but I like that her own disinterest may have resulted in her being left with a property with debts hanging over it instead of a fully paid-for house. I have a lawyer in my town with a reputation as a real asshole. He left a very successful law firm to work for himself. He and his former employer discussed the terms, which clients he would take on, and how future fees from those clients would be divided. Everything looked just perfect. As soon as he walked out the door, he sued the bureau, claiming that the deal was unenforceable and that he was owed 100% of the fees from his clients. He lost and appealed, lost again and appealed to the state Supreme Court, which told him where he belonged and, in extremely diplomatic language, called him an asshole. A nasty court fight over child custody. The ex-wife was an attorney and represented herself. The ex-husband's lawyer was pretty shitty. The woman dragged everything to court to get more compensation from her ex, and his lawyer let it go on, ruining his life with child abuse allegations. And everything took so much money from him that he could barely afford to rent a shitty apartment. And a car was out of the question. The latter two facts were later attributed to the case as well.
Eventually, the ex-wife's father, who was also an attorney, asked for a meeting with the judge, where he mentioned a few things he knew. One of the children suffered from manic depressive disorder, and the ex-wife would stop giving him medication when it was the ex-husband's turn to be with the children. The allegations of abuse stemmed from the fact that he tried to restrain the child when he was having a manic episode due to the discontinuation of medication. The ex-wife specifically made the abuse allegations before the holidays so that the ex-husband would not be able to see the children for Halloween, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. She bragged to relatives that she would cause him maximum emotional damage this way. She also forged documents to inflate her ex-husband's income when child support was being determined. She also slept with his lawyer.